Hodeidah is holding its breath. With the war in Yemen now in its fourth year, government forces and their Saudi Emirati coalition allies are aiming to win control of the city's port, which channels food and medicine to millions of people. I'm Femi Okay.
And I'm Malika Bilal. You're watching the stream live on YouTube. We'll examine what the battle for Hudaida means for Yemenis living an already precarious existence.
The UN considers the war in Yemen, I'm going to quote the UN here, the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But now that fighting close to the northern city of Hodeidah has forced at least 30,000 people to flee their homes.
Yemeni troops backed by Saudi and Emirati forces began Operation Golden Victory against their Houthi opponents on June the 12th. The pro-government forces say they have already taken control of Hudaidah's airport from the Houthis, and now they have their sights on control of the port, just a few miles to the north. So far, it has remained open, but there are concerns that a battle for the port could stop ships from docking.
A clip from our colleagues at AJ Plus explains just how crucial it is for supplies to enter Hudaida. Have a look.
Hudaida is the single most important point of entry for the food and basic supplies needed to prevent famine and the recurrence of a cholera epidemic. We fear that as many as 250,000 people may lose everything, even their lives.
Joining us via the phone from Hudaida is Hussein al-Bukhaiti. He is a pro-Houthi journalist. Welcome to the stream. I'd like to start with this tweet from Bara. He says, the people in Hudaida are afraid of being trapped in a conflict for a long time and are tired of being suppressed by the Houthis. The ideal solution was for the UN to reach a compromise deal. However, now that is too late. Hussein, give our international audience an idea of what life is like in Hudaida right now.
Just during the Saudi-led coalition attempt to attack Hudaida, most of the shops in Hudaida city were closed. But now life is getting back to normal, and people are going out of the street, opening the shops, and the city starts to recover a little bit. People in Hudaida were really afraid of the fight coming to Hudaida, because many, like hundreds of thousands of people depend on Hudaida, like the fishing industry in Yemen. Hudaida is one of the last, it's not only area that still fishermen can go to fish in the coast of Hudaida and the city itself. And as well, it was really important.
Hussein, unfortunately, we don't have the best connection with you. I do apologize. There's one thing I do want to share, though, with our viewers, and this is something you tweeted out not very long ago, and it explains to people who are following you on Twitter that you are at Hodeidah port. Just imagine the only port that serves more than 17 million people is empty and now under threat, and here you are walking around basically doing a little bit of a show and tell. What's the most important thing that we need to know about Hodeidah port from your perspective, Hussein? Just make it brief so that we can hopefully pick up what you're trying to say. Go ahead. Hussein, go ahead. All right, it's very difficult to actually keep that connection going. So I'm going to bring in our other guests that we have. Hussein, thank you for trying to join us, and I apologize for the audio there. For more on the challenges facing civilians in Yemen, we're joined by Rawan Shaif, a journalist and documentary filmmaker who has reported extensively on the war.
In New York, we have Rawiya Raga. She is Senior Crisis Advisor at Amnesty International, which last week released a report on how both the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition and the Houthis are holding up essential aid. Also in New York is Samar Nasser. She is chairwoman of Yemen Aid, a humanitarian organization.
And here in the studio, we have Sanaa Al-Hamdani. She is a Yemeni political affairs commentator and a visiting fellow at Georgetown University. Ladies, welcome. Really looking forward to hearing your perspective. Sanaa, this port, Why is it so important, Hodeidah port, and where are we in this war in Yemen that this port is taking up so much focus right now?
The port has taken our focus, the international focus, ever since the start of the war. At the very start, this plan was laid on the table to kind of have a military battle in Hodeidah, but the Obama administration stepped in and said that it is a red line, purely because the port allows access to 24 million people to deliver aid and medicine and food, which is the lifeline of those people. In Yemen's war now, we have 3 years of fighting. During those 3 years, there was a man-made famine that was created. And the fear of this battle is we already have a humanitarian crisis at play. The fear is we're going to exacerbate it by launching a battle there. A week without aid or medicine could mean that hundreds who depend on that could die. And the problem now with the battle as well is that the country's not prepared for the internally displaced people who had to flee. If they can afford the fuel, of course, they had to flee to other governorates. Some people decided to stay put. What does that mean for the time being? It's the unknown that's terrifying. Are the civilians going to be safe, or are they going to be attacked? But what we know is that the most successful battle in Hodeidah could take up to 2 months. And those 2 months, if the port activities do not return, it means that people are not going to be able to have access to food and medicine. Now, what's on the table is that the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths is trying to strike a deal where the port could be operational regardless of military activity around it.
So keeping that in mind, Summer, I want to read out this tweet from H.G. Flores, who says, "This port is geostrategically important for the Houthis and for the government. If the Saudi-led coalition can capture it, they'll deal a blow to the Houthi ability to resupply. And if the Houthis can resist that coalition, it'll deal a massive blow to the coalition's morale and momentum." So keeping all of that in mind, earlier in the show, though the connection was not that great, I did hear Hussein say that the streets are back open and people are out and about. I know that you have family there in Hodeidah. What are they telling you? What do you make of their experiences vis-a-vis this tweet from HG, who says this port is important?
Right. I mean, this port is really strategic on an international level, but also for Yemen. However, in terms of the people in the country and in the province, specifically, there's two perspectives. They would want the conflict to be very quick rather than it being sluggish. But at the same time, they're very much over the fact that they are suppressed under Houthis. And these are the words of family and community within 10 minutes from the airport and from the port. So this is the type of perspectives that we're dealing with. But in that sense, how do we pressure both sides to respect IHL? And how should we approach solving the issue of aid? And that, I think, should be through the Port of Aden, which is open and fully functional at this time. And our organization personally have shipped a couple of aid distribution packages to them and to the northern province mostly. And it was very successful.
Rawan, you come to this with a perspective of understanding what urban warfare actually means. So if we're looking at the Hodeidah area, and we're looking at this potential of this conflict moving closer and closer to the residents there, what does it mean for them?
I mean, the way Hodeidah is split up means that a third of the geographical land is the airport and 2/3 are the city. In order to get to the port, which the coalition eventually wants to get to, as this is their aim, they have to go through a huge span of civilian areas that are tightly packed. Hodeidah city is a very densely populated city, and it means risking a street battle, essentially. This has happened before in Tez, and so it won't be a clean and cut fight. And so at this point, ideally, it would be best to approach a plan with the UN that means the Houthis relinquish their power as a port to a third authority in order to save civilians from being caught up in a street fight. Houthis have been preparing for a street battle in the last week and a half. They've been building trenches and digging trenches in the middle of the road between the airport and the port. And the coalition as well has been trying to breach the airport to get to the port. However, I mean, the fight has mostly remained at the airport until now, with both sides claiming that they still have power over the airport.
What's interesting about the port of Hodeidah is that it's not the only port that's in Yemen. We have two other ports. One is shut down, one is slightly operational, and that is the port of Aden that Summer mentioned earlier. The problem is those two ports cannot replace what Hodeidah is. It's been a struggle to kind of get them up and running the way that Hodeidah is. Even, the American administration sent 2 cranes to Hodeidah's port to help in the delivery of aid, because it is the one port that is able to kind of carry out aid on that level. Now, what's terrifying in the process is that the city of Aden and other cities are considered Houthi-free territory, and yet they don't witness any stability, and the port in Aden has failed to substitute the port of Hodeidah. And I think if they're able to have a port run like the port of Hodeidah, it would be a very welcome change, because the people's lives depend on this.
Malika, I think it'd be fair to say that most of our audience is so focused on what happens to the people who are living in Yemen right now and the humanitarian aspect. I just want to show you from about a week ago what civilians in Hodeidah were thinking about, they were concerned about, with the idea that there might be this assault coming onto the port. Have a listen.
I was working in the Hodeidah port, and now if the port closes, where will I go to work? When this siege comes and this disaster happens, where am I going to find work? The only thing we have is to die. We don't have anything other than death.
We don't have gas to cook with. My husband has a motorcycle that he used to work with on the port road, and now the road is closed, and the bike's motor has broken down. And we're in the path of the rain and wind, which take our houses with them. I have a young daughter who's exhausted and sick, and we can't get her medication or anything, only the necessary food. If a war happens, what are we going to do?
So hearing reports like that and stories, firsthand accounts like that, is what leads people online, Rauya, to point fingers. So Shireen on Twitter says, like the attack on Yemen, the battle for Hodeidah is misguided and shows a callous disregard for human life. Their willingness to use starvation and commit mass murder may help them win the battle, but they shouldn't expect Yemeni resistance to Saudi and UAE occupation to end. So pointing the finger there at presumably coalition forces. On the other side, though, Wissam says citizens of Yemen continue to lose as warring elites continue to dance on each other's head. All sides of the conflict fail to offer the most basic services, yet excel in creating a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. Rauya, I give this to you because you recently came out with a report, your organization did, saying that both sides of this are to blame for some of what we're seeing today.
Well, there are two elements here. We're deeply concerned, of course, about the protection of civilians. And what we've documented in the past is that all parties to the conflict, or both sides, both warring sides now, be it the Saudi Arabia-led coalition and the local forces it's backing on the ground, or the Houthi armed group, have in the past disregarded or disrespected the laws of war. And we've seen the impact of that on civilians through civilian casualties, civilians being killed or injured, as well as damage to the civilian infrastructure, which of course is a violation of international humanitarian law. So with that in mind, we're deeply concerned with that track record of these warring parties and what that could mean in this ongoing operation on a larger scale. Secondly, as you mentioned, we did indeed just recently publish a report in which we documented how both parties have restricted access to essential goods and aids. The Saudi Arabia-led coalition through imposing or severely restricting the entry of aid into Yemen, and the Houthi armed forces in terms of the movement of that aid on the ground. On the coalition side, we documented, for example, unnecessary inspections, in addition to the already existing inspection mechanism by the United Nations. That severe delay that we have seen has particularly affected the provision of healthcare because of the lack of fuel or access to fuel proper health facilities, for example. That's a deep concern for us. We've also seen on the, and of course, our concern is that the timing and manner by which these restrictions were imposed by the coalition would indicate that they amount to collective punishment, because they came in response to these rockets that were, or these missiles that were fired by the Houthis into Saudi Arabia. So the timing and manner would indicate that this may amount to the war crime of collective punishment. The Houthi armed group also has imposed bureaucratic measures, has imposed unnecessary delays on the permit system for the distribution of aid on the ground. And we've spoken to aid workers who told us that they've essentially elicited bribes and kickbacks, illegal payments, in order to approve the distribution and control the distribution of aid. So both parties essentially delaying or exacerbating an already dire humanitarian situation on the ground.
Sanaa, this is not a shock, because this is war, this is conflict. Out of all of the actors involved in this conflict, who is genuinely concerned about the people of Yemen?
Unfortunately, we've seen on both sides that unfortunately, the conflict is so internal. It's an internal issue. It is a crisis that is rooted in political history. So on Rawia's point, yes, we have seen this issue of delay. However, we've also seen and documented that Houthis end up taking a lot of these aids and putting them in black markets where even some civilians can't even have access to it, or should have been access to it, but they have to pay threefolds or fourfolds of this. At the end of the day, I think IHL should be respected on both sides. However, we've seen on ground that through our work with Aden, in Aden, everything's going well and very smooth. When we hit the northern province, we get stuck with random checkpoints that are not even legal to even give in aid.
Who's most helpful in your work trying to get aid to people who desperately need it? Where are you getting the most help, Sanaa?
We are getting, in terms of finances or in terms of the projects itself?
Projects.
We're getting a lot of our support with partners here in the United States. We've also been in communication with a lot of Arab-based organizations as well. And I have to admit, we have delayed and postponed the fact that we can give to the port of, ship everything through the port of Hodeidah, for the reason of Houthis being in control of that port. We do have access from both sides, but it's much more complicated and unfortunately much more random in aspects of delay and documentation when it comes to Hodeidah.
So I wanted to read two perspectives, picking up on what you're saying there from Twitter. This is Samar Ahmed, who writes in, the biggest concern remains the humanitarian situation, as a majority of civilians rely on aid coming from that port. I hope the Arab coalition has a plan in place that will mitigate the suffering of the people who will be directly affected by the battle in Hudaida. So keeping that in mind, Samah, a plan in place. I want to read out this tweet here because it references something you mentioned earlier. Shireen says, the newly displaced will now join the 3 million IDPs and the 8.4 million Yemenis who will starve to death without humanitarian aid. However, this aid may never reach them. You mentioned earlier that your family and Sanaa are seeing the influx of residents from Hudaida and from other parts of Yemen. What do those circumstances look like? What are they telling you?
It seems like everybody's been suffering for the past 3 years because there's been a delay in giving people their salaries. And that's a problem because people, even if there are goods around, they can't afford to buy them. And only those who are wealthy or have family outside of Yemen can send in remittances and help them purchase these goods. Now, you have a situation where a small city is getting flooded. The interesting thing about Sanaa is it's called to be under Houthi control, but they continue to welcome people from all over Yemen as refugees or internally displaced people. I think the problem is the Houthis continue to hide behind humanitarian disasters and are pretending to represent Yemen in the war against an outside influence, and at the same time, the Saudi Arabia and UAE Arab coalition, they're hiding behind the idea that they are trying to rescue Yemen and restore the legitimate government. But it's becoming clear in the Battle of Hodeidah that both of them don't really care about the people of Yemen, but they are fighting over who's going to win and control Yemen politically. And through that war, they inserted sectarian terms, and the people who pay for this are the civilians. And
if we're going to talk about really the impact on civilians, if I may interrupt, sorry, I really, it's very important for us to highlight that irrespective of the military developments on the ground, it's crucial that the port should remain open, and that we ensure that there are no restrictions to the aid, that the flow of aid and goods is not impeded, irrespective of who is in control of the situation militarily on the ground. Safe passage for civilians is also a really crucial point for us, because we have been seeing how it's been a very difficult journey for people. Mind you, while we're talking about the battle for Hodeidah city and the port at the moment, we have been seeing ongoing military operations in the governorate since December. Tens of thousands of people have already fled. Practically everybody we spoke to said that they had sold precious belongings, wedding bands, livestock, put up property deeds in order to be able to afford the displacement journey. So if we just want to, it's really important for us to refocus the impact, the conversation on the impact on civilians.
I hear exactly what you're saying. Let me just introduce you to this headline from The Guardian. UN envoy confident of Yemen deal to prevent Hodeidah port violence. The ideal is that the port gets handed over to the United Nations rather than to either of the sides involved in the conflict. Is that possible? Could that happen?
If Martin Griffiths, who's the special UN envoy to Yemen, pulls off a miracle, it is possible. So before him, we had 2 UN special envoys who failed to bring everybody to the table for negotiations. Yeah. But if he manages to do that, then we can be surely confident that the thing about Martin Griffiths, and this is to be said, that he has the weight of the EU behind him, he has the weight of the British government, he is a British citizen himself, and he has the weight of the US behind him. So him being a British citizen could potentially change the game here, because he's got superpowers backing him up. And right now there are secret talks about a plan on the table. He's actually set to meet the president of Yemen in 2 days in the city of Aden. And he's supposed to present a plan that everybody agrees upon. If that happens, we can kind of take a deep breath and just be like, phew, we can now feed and deliver aid to these people, and we can move forward towards negotiations in the future.
So you said it will take a miracle. HG here might agree. He says, how could the UN talk down the US, Iran, Saudi Arabia? What incentives could the UN provide to these powers that would bring the conflict closer to an end? Rawan, I'll give that one to you.
Thank you. So, basing off what Sanaa just said, I think now more than ever, the chance of the Houthis agreeing to relinquish power of the port is very, very likely. In a speech around 4 days ago, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, who is the leader of the Houthis, said that they were more than happy to give the port to the UN, who would then oversee it through another entity, so a third party, and any revenues that were taken from the port during the time where the UN would be held responsible would be transferred directly to the central bank to oversee people's salaries. So I think people are more keen right now on pushing a peace plan. Martin Griffiths has been traveling back and forth between Sanaa and the Emirates and the UK and the US, trying to make both sides agree to a reasonable deal. However, the fighting still continues because whoever manages to gain as much ground as possible while negotiations are going on means that they are the stronger power in this. And so if a peace plan is on the table, it would save the vast majority of the population in Hudaida from what will turn into an absolute disaster.
Ladies, thank you so much for your insight, the wisdom that you bring to this conversation. Sanaa, you explained if the superpowers could get together, it almost feels like you need superpowers in order to end this conflict in Yemen. Malika, how's this conversation been playing out online?
I'll end it with this from Isam, which kind of wraps up what a lot of people are thinking. Regardless of how big of a military breakthrough this Hudaida battle might seem for either side, what remains to be seen is how this can translate into improving the constantly deteriorating economic and humanitarian conditions of Yemenis.
Thank you for your comments. Keep them coming on Twitter, YouTube, and of course, aljazeera.com/the stream. Malika and I will see you always online. Bye for now.